Starting off with our first news story here, Idaho leads the nation in spending. This comes by KTVB7 by Justin Core. According to a recent report from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Idaho is leading the nation in terms of annual spending growth. The report shows that personal consumption expenditure, or PCE, because we got to have an acronym for everything, baby, which measures everything people buy, rose by 11.8% from 2021 to 2022 in the state. This is a significant increase across the state. While Idahoans' annual spending at over $43,000 is still relatively low compared to other states, it is an upward trend. Stephen Peterson, Associated Clinical Professor of Economics at the University of Idaho, contributes this increase partly to inflation, but primarily to the state's rapid growing and diversifying economy. Quote, "Most of this is very good news," says Peterson. "We have a rapidly growing population. Our economy is doing very well. It's diversifying, and we have a low unemployment rate." End quote. However, there is one significant issue that is hindering the state's economic progress: the cost of housing. Despite recent trends showing a plateau in home prices and a slight drop in rent, housing costs remain high. Peterson explains that only a fraction of families can afford a median home price, which is limiting the number of job openings being filled in Idaho. Quote, "Frankly, those unfilled positions are costing Idaho jobs," said Peterson. "If your employees cannot find or afford rent and housing on your wage, they're not going to take your job." End quote. This housing issue could potentially lead to an economic stagnation and force Idahoans to leave the state. Peterson suggests that the new zoning codes, like the one recently passed in Boise, could help increase the housing stock and alleviate this problem. With that said, I did briefly do a little bit of research on that about the zoning codes that Peterson was referring to give you guys kind of a little bit of extra context because I had extra time this week. So I was on time. In them, they allow for a greater diversity of houses, so smaller footprint per home, but more of them. Also, a reducing of parking requirements in those new codes. So basically, it reduces the amount of parking required for new housing and stuff, which was a definite point of contention during the public testimony on that one. And then also lastly, creating mixed use zoning. The new laws created mixed use zoning along transit corridors in high activity areas. There's also some other things in there, but for the sake of housing, I just focused on those main ones that were affected in the zoning things. This is definitely something I think we have all felt that, like, cool, I've got a job. This is great. Everyone's got a job. You know, there's jobs everywhere being posted. I know tons of friends are like, yeah, I got a job. I'm going there. That's awesome. But then everyone turns around and is like, well, I'm employed and I'm working well and like the pay's pretty great, but I on my own can't afford a, $1,200 a month rent type of apartment or different things. And I have to be this close to town for this thing and for that job. Or people trying to buy their own home, like, well, I'm getting paid enough to maybe pay for the rental, but then I'm not making enough to even buy a house. And so it's definitely this weird quandary, or in my sake, thankfully, I've been able to figure out ways to make it work. Definitely being like, well, how do I actually grow? What type of jobs do I need to go after to actually be able to stay in Idaho? And sometimes the price tag to get those can be tricky to want to even stay in the state when there's so much more lucrative jobs outside of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum to be in where we have jobs and we have work to do, but the economy of the state is not necessarily keeping up with everything it needs to. Housing prices are growing faster than wages are increasing. And that seems to be in line with inflation right now, where inflation is exceeding the wage increases. And so I don't really know how you solve this problem, although solving other big problems would probably help.
Yeah, I mean, here again, I will automatically defer to other people, but in my humble small amount of wisdom that the Lord has given me, if I would have to guess, there definitely are bigger things feeding into it. But overall, I would say just in the U.S., outside of Idaho, the U.S. dollar or whatever currency that we deal in America, it needs to be stable for homes, for economies, and we're seeing the results of a not stable and very misused currency at the moment by the U.S. Treasury with the U.S. dollar. And we're seeing kind of some of the results with that, with inflation. I would say you might have not seen this as much if people are like, hey, yeah, I use cash to transact. But if we were a society where we use like a two-stage currency where everyone transacts, for peer-to-peer things in cash, but then everyone holds their assets within like gold or more physical things that are independent of inflation, then it probably wouldn't hurt people as bad because they're like, oh, yeah, I'm not getting paid as much, but also all the money I just stockpiled, it hasn't depreciated at all. And any of the money I do get doesn't depreciate at all. So maybe that's a silver lining for those of us that if you do have a lot of money and you're sitting there and you're like, well, I can't do it. Well, maybe put those into assets that will outpace inflation is the best understanding that I understand in economics. They're, again, not financial advice, but that would probably be one of it. And then in Idaho, the biggest thing right now is, as much as we might not like it, supply and demand. It's an age-old thing. If prices are high, if you make more of the product, it will bring the costs down. And so as much as those people out there, and I understand and I 100% sympathize with the camp that wants Idaho to stay this bastion of rural country traditional values, and I totally understand it. But by restricting or trying to prevent more housing going in, now, we can discuss on how that housing goes in, but restricting it or preventing more housing from going in is only going to make the primary problem that Idaho has worse, personally, and my deduction. So we can't stop. We need to keep either we need to figure out how to cause less people to come here without causing other problems, or we need to increase the production so it either equals the amount of people coming or is greater so that we can see a decrease in the price for homes.
Yeah. Supply and demand isn't going anywhere. So we do need to build more homes. The problem with that is, where are we building homes? How are we building them? Are established neighborhoods okay with building new homes? This is the problem. This is one of the problems that has caused Californian cities to be as bad as they are when it comes to house prices, is that they won't build new homes or economically viable homes near neighborhoods with expensive homes because the expensive neighborhoods don't want to drive their property values down, which I understand. But at the same time, when you get more people moving in who need lower, I was stumbling over how to word this, but houses that aren't expensive.
Affordable houses?
Things like apartments. Affordable. Yeah, but the problem is when you say affordable housing,
we get the government commentation of like affordable housing brought to you by the government or whatever.
Right. So ignoring what our government labels as quote unquote either low income or affordable housing, just affordable housing that you can buy. That's, apartments are that way, condos, townhomes, things like that, or duplexes, quadplexes. Multifamily housing is, I think, a really good way to solve that problem. And it becomes higher density residential living, which is important. It's not what everybody desires and longs for, but it is affordable and you can live there and you can house a lot of people in a small square footage, which is important when your population is growing.